McCartney? Can I
I've
ask?
been with them for almost a year. It'll be a year in July. I really like it. It's really
That's
cool, and I
good.
love your whole style is very nice, by the
Oh,
way.
thank you. I didn't do much today. It was just it was a red theme, and I don't know. But thank you.
I,
I
I love
appreciate
it.
it. I like the
Yeah,
moons
we're
on
getting
your shirt. I was gonna.
thank you.
Those are
Yeah,
cute.
it's a comfy shirt. It's been a draining day, so I'm
Yes.
yeah.
It's been kind of crazy the past few weeks too, because it was like I started and it was a little quiet, and then all of a sudden elections are coming up, and now everything is,
Right.
like
Yeah.
there's a lot going on, but in a good way. I mean, it's like it's one of those things where I was telling someone the other day that I think part of my work is just chasing down people and being like, please email me back because the election is very soon. Like it's just, it is what it is. But yeah.
So, welcome back to Alabama Care, everyone. I'm McCartney Hagar, and this is Nikki Watkins from Adap, and I'm so excited to interview her today. It's going to be great. So, tell us about Adap and what is it, and what do you do there?
Sure. I'm Nikki Watkins. Pronouns are they, them. And I have
Oh,
been with
hi.
ADAP. No, you're okay. I didn't say it yet. So, but thank you. I have been with ADAP since March of this year, but I've worked with ADAP a lot longer than that on a lot of different disability advocacy projects. I have known James Tucker, our director, for a few years now, and I come to the work from working in independent living and working in the advocacy space for people with disabilities, different types of disabilities, all ages, all different varieties. And what I do at ADAP focuses mostly around voting rights and voting law and voting advocacy as well in Alabama. And it's one of those things that's gotten more attention in recent years, especially with around the country. We're seeing increasing amounts of legislation passed that are in various ways restricting voting for a lot of members of the public. And in Alabama, too, um, we recently, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but we recently had that ban on curbside voting, which was beneficial for
Mhm.
a lot of people with disabilities during the pandemic. So there's a lot to be done around voting advocacy in Alabama. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I was actually gonna get into that a bit later about I've heard that KIV has recently made some statements about limiting voting even more on the campaign trail. So we'll get into that a little bit as well. And I did hear about the curbside voting. I heard there was a lawsuit. Were you a part of that?
Yeah, ADAP was a part of that along with People First, and there was the hope that we would get to uh, continue with curbside voting, but then there was a specific law passed in the Alabama legislature to prohibit it permanently, with no exceptions. I'll add too, which is I think relevant because I was listening to some advocates from New York talk the other day about how if your polling place isn't accessible, first of all, you should call us if that happens, but if you do run into a situation where your polling place is inaccessible in a lot of other states, you can ask for curbside assistance. But here we can't even do that anymore. So I do think it's worth mentioning that it is a complete and total ban, too.
That's that's terrible. It's honestly, I know it must be really exhausting to be right in the center of this and to be following it so closely. I know it's hard to do what you do, and we appreciate it. We appreciate everyone doing their best to try and keep these things from going through. So, how did you get started with activism and working with ADAP? I know you used to work for DRR.
Yeah, I tell people I've been in disability advocacy my whole life. I was born with spina bifida, and in 2018, I had a below the knee amputation on my right leg, and I think it's what gave me the drive to be more involved in this work. And I had always been what I would call a self advocate, right? Like having to advocate for accommodations and healthcare.
Mhm.
And healthcare in particular is probably the big one for me, just because of all of the barriers and hurdles we always have to jump through. And then becoming more comfortable with speaking about my own mental health and my own mental illness history, which I think a lot of us know, can be really stigmatizing, but it's also really
Mhm.
empowering to be able to talk about publicly and just to say, this is me, and I know this is a lot of you too, and that's okay, right? Like we're all here doing this kind of advocacy work together. And I wanted to be more involved in this space, particularly after I had been involved in healthcare advocacy. And I got really invested in finding out more about what the Alabama legislature was doing and how we could be involved on a policy level. And that's part of what eventually led me to ADAP too. I worked with people in independent living to identify a lot of what their needs were, and I could see where the barriers were and what the gaps are. And most of the folks that I worked with then and see now are people who are either at risk of being institutionalized or have been in the past, people who are living in poverty, people who are racially marginalized. And so I don't see that reflected in the way our system and our structure operates. And I think that for me, that was a lifelong goal of mine is to, I suppose, and this is going to sound a little corny, but leave the world a little bit better than I found it. And that I think that that's kind of an
Absolutely.
obligation that we all have. So, yeah.
I love everything you just said. I feel like we're
Thank
very
you.
much on the same wavelength with what we'd like to do. I definitely agree with like I feel like the way disability is represented and thought about, especially in the South, is that it's a very like when you see people advocating, it's a very white, straight sort of
Mm-hmm.
representation. But there's so much of our community that has so many other barriers and statuses along with disability. And I think it gets taken for granted that we're just this small little portion of the population when there's so many people. And the fact that you brought up institutionalization is so important because I feel like people think that that's in the past, that a Willowbrook was a thing, and then we stopped doing that forever. But it it's been I don't think people understand that for disabled people, this is still a real fear. It's like, what if I end up in this kind of situation? What if I end up in this home and they don't let me express myself the way I need to, do what I want? You know, just basic human rights are violated on a daily basis. And yet, disability is portrayed as this sort of very small issue, and it's just people in wheelchairs, and we're doing great, you
Mm-hmm.
know? So I think it's really
Mm-hmm.
important what you're doing, and that you're bringing light to some of the some of the less talked about and the issues that we don't want to face a lot of times.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I do think it's often portrayed as a very either niche issue or one from a very white middle class perspective too, right? It's
Hmm.
just not everyone has access to the same resources. Not everyone can have a team of people helping them to live independently. Not everyone has internet, you know what I mean? Especially in
Hmm.
the South. And I mean, and this is, doubly, triply true for people who are incarcerated in different ways, either in institutions or in prisons. But access to
Hmm.
those resources, I mean, how do you expect anyone to become a self advocate if they don't have connections and peers and people that can identify with them as part of their community? I mean, it's just, it's very difficult. And just our resources are already limited, and then trying to distribute those equitably is just, I mean, it's just difficult in our state. I think like there are a lot of barriers and there's a lot of poverty here. And I mean, even especially in the wake of the pandemic too, I think a lot of things kind of fell by the wayside in schools and in hospitals, and in terms of disability advocacy and providing advocacy options for students and patients and just adults. I mean, some resources appeared and a lot of them disappeared, and trying to navigate that is hard for me, and it's been my work for years. So I mean, for someone who if they're not in that professionally, I have a lot of empathy for people just trying to get the help they need, and they don't know who to call or where to go. So
That's something I've seen a lot as well. And I hope that with what we're doing here at Alabama Care, we can kind of get people to you, get people to ADAP, get them to DRR, get them to People First. That way, you know, I think that one of the biggest barriers is that people don't know what's out there. And
mhm.
there's definitely a social component that comes with disability to where you feel like you don't deserve some of the resources. So you wouldn't imagine that someone would create these opportunities for you. So that's
I
something
do
that's been a huge part of my journey as well.
Well, I do think I'm glad you said that because I do think that's a big part of it too, is that it took me a long time to use the word disabled to describe myself, not so much
Mhm.
because I felt a lot of shame, but because people have very varying reactions to that. And now I think I'm empowered enough to be able to say, no, it's a word and it's an identity and I'm proud of it. But when I was younger, I didn't have the language for that. And I think, having tried to explain to professors I have a disability, I can't do X, Y, and Z, left me either feeling their pity or just their confusion. And now I know more what to do with that. But I think that's one of the biggest challenges we all face is getting to a place where we can say, I have a disability, I need help is also a big, step in a journey, right? Like that's no joke. I mean, a lot of people for a lot of reasons that are valid don't want to admit or think of themselves that way because of societal stigma, and that's scary, right? Like so
Mhm.
I but once you know you've got a community that'll have your back, it makes all the difference. It's just you won't know it's there if you don't get to a place in your journey where you start to be ready to identify that way.
Exactly. That's something I think is a huge issue with colleges as well, and maybe even voting, because I know people with disabilities that have, do not identify that way and maybe don't vote in accordance with their needs as a disabled person. So why do you think that it's important that like people associate their identity, really internalize it, and to understand what that means for them in the society, and in turn vote in a way that can actually help get their needs met so they can participate more?
I think a couple things, and one of them is if you're voting in a physical polling location, and this is something that is probably more specific to physical disabilities, but one of the first things I tell people is if you have a disability that has an impact on your mobility, you can jump to the front of the line. That is part of state law. A lot of people don't know that, and a lot of people are afraid to ask for it too. This is also true if you're elderly, right? So I think a lot of people are afraid that they'll maybe take up space in that way, but it is totally okay to do. They're not allowed to ask you what your disability is. You don't have to demonstrate that you have a mobility issue, right? You can just jump to the front of the line. Um, Related to that, I think is access to polling places, and I think this maybe goes without saying, but I'm going to say it. Polling places should always be accessible, and if you run into a situation where they're not, please call us. That's part of what we are here for. But accessibility means a lot of different things to different people, right? So I
Right.
think that, and one of the ones that I've been talking about lately the most has been helping someone vote. And I think that this doesn't come up that much, but there's a couple different aspects of this. If a voter is blind or has low vision, we don't have a braille ballot in Alabama, which means that you need an assistant, you need a person to help you vote. And I want to make this really clear. Anyone can ask for help with voting. Absolutely anyone. It doesn't have to be a person with a disability. The only thing that the helper cannot be is your boss or a union representative. So if you are just Joe whomever and you don't have a disability and you need help, you need someone to read your ballot for you because you're getting confused or you don't think of yourself as a person with a disability, you can still ask for assistance. That's your right. Um, but the reason I mention blind and low vision voters especially is because we all have the right to a private vote, right? We all have this sort
Mhm.
of, it's built into our system. It's part of democracy. And blind voters don't have that in the same way people who can see perfectly well do, right? Now they have to ask for assistance, which means another person helping them with their vote. And there's no shame to that, but there's also no reason that it has to be that way. We could have a braille ballot and it would solve that problem. I think with voting assistance, one of the things I talk about a lot is that it's okay to ask always. And it's also okay to be asked. There are things that you should know if you're helping someone vote and that you should be careful to be neutral. You can't tell someone why they should vote for somebody, right? You can't, if they tell you I'm voting for so and so, you shouldn't look at them and go, ugh, because you don't want to be doing
Right.
that, right? Like you want to just honor their right to vote. But I think so many of us consider our rights to vote sacred in some way, even if we don't necessarily believe that voting will make all of the magical changes that we need in order to dismantle systemic barriers. I think all of us feel deeply personally about that right. And there's no reason why people with disabilities should not have the same access as people who don't have disabilities. And trying to make that clear across the board, you might get a poll worker who doesn't understand that you have the right to assistance. You might get someone at in your line that says, "Hey, you don't need to go to the front of the line." You might feel uncomfortable with the fact that, hey, maybe it would be better for me if I requested an absentee ballot and decided to vote that way because going to my polling place is really burdensome for me and I don't have transportation and it's hard for me to get there and my body hurts. Any any number of reasons. And that's something I really encourage too. I think absentee voting is gaining more ground as a way to vote, especially because of COVID-19. Like, 'cause there was this period
Right.
where it was much easier to do. But if you have a disability that impacts your ability to get to your polling place, you can vote absentee. And it's actually pretty easy. I mean, you can do it all by mail, which I know, nobody loves mail anymore. But I mean, and to be fair, I don't either. But it is easier than me going and standing in line and figuring out where to go and all of that, right? So that's also an option. Sort of a long-winded answer to the question you asked, but
No, no, I think all of that was very necessary. And I'm going to check the chat in a minute, but one thing I'd like to get your opinion on is I know during the recent election and even the 2016 election, I had a lot of disabled friends saying, "Well, I want to vote this way, but I feel like if I do, I need someone to help me, and I feel like my parents are going to be upset or they'll be disappointed if we don't vote the same way." So how do you do you have anything that they can do in that kind of situation to help protect their privacy?
yeah, that's one thing that I would say it is worthwhile giving us a call for one, and also reaching out to local chapters where you might find community in some way, like People First, like you mentioned, or finding groups on Facebook of other people with disabilities in your area, or finding local people, maybe contacting, if you're in school, contacting disability support services, to see if there's a peer that you might feel comfortable with going to the polls with. Or it's also true that if you're comfortable asking a friend who won't judge you for the way that you are voting, ask them for help. It doesn't have to be a parent or a guardian or an elder. It can be anybody, and I think that's a good point to bring up, because the reason the law exists, that is supposed to be preventing a person who is the boss of someone else, right? Like, you don't want your boss coming in to help you vote, even if you love your boss, because there's the potential that they could influence you to vote the way that they want you to vote. And the same holds true for parents and family, right? Those relationships are
Right.
complicated and they're emotional, right? And we don't want to necessarily drive a wedge between ourselves and our family members, but it can, especially if you're asking someone who has opposite views from you to help you vote. And you can tell them, right, they're not allowed to do that, but it doesn't mean they won't hold it against you later, right? Because relationships are
Right.
complicated, and that's just humans. But I do think finding someone you trust is the most important part of it. And also finding someone who, if you do feel, you can look up sample ballots online for your area as well too. So if you do that and a lot of stuff confuses you, you can find someone to ask that you trust. You can call us too. There are lots of different ways that you can kind of navigate that. I know for my own part too, I studied history in college for both my bachelor's and my master's degree, and I still can't read half of the statewide amendments. Like, I still have to get lawyer friends to be like, what is this saying? Because I am losing my mind. And they're deliberately written that way. I mean, they're written that way
Mhm.
by people who are often also lawyers, right? And there are ways of writing that make sense, but it can be difficult for the general public to make sense of it. Um, I will say too, and this is something that my voting rights fellow colleague and I just recently discovered when we were working on something, is we were trying to source really good nonpartisan websites for candidates and for issues and definitions of political parties. And these are questions that we've gotten before too. And I say this not to sound remotely condescending, but newsforkids.com is excellent at writing in plain language what political parties are, what their platforms are, what they stand for, in a very, sort of 500-mile away view, right? Like to get an idea of
Mhm.
what these things are and how am I supposed to feel about climate change or how am I, and what does this candidate say on this issue? You know, plain language is always excellent. I love this website. And like I said, I spent my college years studying this stuff and I'm still like, I just need something basic. Like I need to know how this person feels about X. Is this part of this party's platform? I don't know. I will go find out. Um, but these are the kinds of resources too. If anyone needs help, we're happy to point those out to you too. So if you want to ever call us and ask those kinds of questions, we're there to answer those kinds of things. We won't tell you who to vote for, but we can answer that much.
I think that's absolutely great. Even like you said, I mean, I'm very interested in policy and things like this. And then when I went to vote, I was able to vote in the 2020 election, and even I was pulling up the plain language versions that they had
Mm-hmm.
online, and it was still a bunch of jargon. Like, how is this equitable? How is, like, for example, if you have people with intellectual disabilities that also deserve to vote and
Mm-hmm.
deserve to know what's going on
Mm-hmm.
with their future in their country, and yet so many resources are, you know, it doesn't matter what your reading level is, you won't understand it unless you have
Yeah.
a law degree. So I think
Yeah.
that's a really important point. And I'm glad that there are resources out there that y'all can point us to that can make that a little bit easier.
Yeah,
So,
it is. I do think your point about especially people with intellectual disabilities, the system as it stands is very inaccessible, especially because nothing is written in plain language that goes on a ballot other than essentially which candidate for president do you like? You know what I mean? And that
mhm.
the rest of it is just, you know, it's a lot. And I think having those resources is really valuable. And there aren't enough of them, but there are some. So it's a start.
Mhm. Well, a start is better than nothing. And I didn't even know
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the resources you pointed out and a lot of the accommodations, like being able to go to the front of the line. I didn't know that was a thing. I'm so used to, in college you have to apply for everything, and it's a whole system.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad that these things exist because I had no idea, and I'm sure a lot of people need them that aren't aware of them. So, what does equal
Yeah.
voting access look like to you? What's the ideal situation?
I think equal voting access to me. So I don't know if anybody watching or if you've ever seen that graphic of the difference between equality and equity, but that's always what I
Yeah.
think of. And equality, yeah, like equality being okay, everyone has the same box to stand on so they can see over a fence, but that doesn't really help someone who is short or the tall person maybe didn't need it in the first place, right? So I think when I think about equal voting access, I think about the fact that okay, so let's say all of the polling places in Alabama are fully ADA compliant and accessible, which is probably a
Hmm.
pipe dream anyway, but let's say that, right? Like, let's pretend that that's true. And let's pretend that everyone can get an absentee ballot if they need one. Well, in order to get an absentee ballot, you need to have a voter ID. And in order to send off your absentee ballot, you need to have a copy of your voter ID included. So if you live alone and you have a disability and you don't have a printer and you don't have a copy machine at home, then you have to find somebody to do that for you. And if you don't have an ID in the first place, then that's a whole other process that also involves going somewhere and maybe you can't get transportation. So when I think about all of the steps that are required to do those things that an able bodied person with financial means or transportation can do easily, that doesn't look like equality to me. So I and this is complicated stuff because of course it's not easy to make laws that apply equally to everyone, which is always the question in a democracy anyway. I mean, the ADA doesn't cover everything we'd like it to either.
No.
But I think that trying to find ways of accommodating people is something that the law, especially voting law, has not done much of, especially in recent years as we've
Mhm.
seen more and more restrictions on like voter ID and on banning curbside voting and that's putting more barriers in place, not dismantling them. So
Right.
I don't know if it's possible for me to imagine like a total utopia where we have total equal access, but I think we can do a lot better than we are in terms of listening to people when they say, I really wanted to vote and I can't because I can't get there. I have nobody to take me. There is no place I can get a driver's license in my county anymore. I don't know how to get transportation to Montgomery, and I can't figure out how to get a voter ID. I don't have my birth certificate, and so on, right?
Right.
To me, these are things that don't need to come up and do just and usually it's political kind of like gamesmanship, right? It usually has to do with political parties going back and forth about various issues. Right now, voting is a hot topic and voter fraud is a hot topic. And in reality, there's very limited instances of voter fraud, at least certainly not enough to justify all of the barriers that are in place. So I guess when I think about moving in the right direction, it would be in favor of more accommodations, not fewer accommodations. And that seems to be where we're
Mhm.
headed. And that's something that frustrates me deeply. And I imagine you too. So,
Yeah, I think a lot of our viewers can relate to this feeling that you're just being a person as you are is always under attack because nobody thinks about the people with disabilities and why we have things like curbside voting. It's always this imaginary threat that's coming from somewhere, and that's more
mm-hmm.
interesting. And it, frankly, it's like reality TV. Meanwhile,
Mm-hmm.
the real people that are representatives are elected by us, we are not getting our needs met. So I've been following the race for governor, and it's been a lot. It's a lot of just watch a campaign ad, and you're you're concerned. So what? So as I said, Kay Ivey has talked about limiting voting more if she's reelected. So is this how much of this? How much of it is a concern to you? And what can our voters or what can our viewers do to protect themselves from any restrictions?
I think one of the things that's all, and I mean, it's, I know I sound like a parrot at this point, but it's definitely any move in favor of increasing barriers is, in my view, not justified. Simply because, like I said, we see an occasional, a voter fraud headline make national news, and it's like one person voted in two counties, or one person forgot that they were supposed to vote in Ohio and voted in California instead, or whatever. It is never been enough to sway an election. There's never been an instance of a situation where it would have done so, right? And so adding more restrictions is, like you said, maybe more glamorous than the actual need, right? Like it makes better headlines to sound like I really care about voter integrity. But to me, if you really care about voter integrity, if you're a disabled constituent, you should call those folks and tell them how you feel about it and what your experience has been voting and if it's always been seamless for you. Um, and the difficulty there too is a lot of people who have faced the most significant barriers are also the poorest and the most marginalized Alabamians, and in which case their priority number one is probably not calling the governor or the gubernatorial candidates because it's going to be, how do I feed my family today? Like what can I do about this? And voting is sort of a distant thing that doesn't seem to people like this is going to directly impact me, but it does. And I think that's something I always want to emphasize is that local matters more than national, at least for us here, right? And it's not to say that, I mean, I certainly encourage you to vote in the presidential election too, but we've got the May 24th primaries coming up. We will have 2022 midterms coming up after that. And
Mhm.
who your state representatives are, who your governor is, who your secretary of state is going to make more of an impact on your vote and your life and those policies than the president will. Just
Mhm.
because it's like trying to move mountains in terms of like national Congress, especially when it comes to voting law, because each state has different regulations and rules for voting. I would also add too that the person in charge of voting in Alabama is the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is also going to be running in the upcoming May 24th primaries. So if you have views on what you think that should look like, definitely contact those candidates now and tell them, like, this is what I would expect from you if you want my vote. Whatever those views may be, I think that there's a lot of value, especially in election season, holding politicians accountable. And a lot of people
Mhm.
don't know that the Secretary of State is in charge of voting, right? Because nationally, that's
I
not
didn't.
true, right? Well, I mean, I don't blame you. I don't know if I learned that until much later in life. Like the the Secretary of State nationally handles, foreign policy and all of these other concerns, but statewide they handle the voter rolls and voter roll purges and voting regulations, and they can't make a law on their own, right? Like that still has to go through the state legislature, but they do set policy and they do manage the voter rolls. And so, if you and I always encourage people to reach out to the Secretary of State's office and to their local, like their state officials, like their state senators and their state representatives, and say, I'd really like to see you to support legislation that does X or Y. And it's their job to listen to you. I think sometimes we forget as people, especially as disabled people, the power that we have in this country. I mean, and something like around half of the population of Alabama has a disability. Not everyone
Yeah.
identifies as disabled, but
Right.
it is a lot of people. And people of like all political leanings and all colors and all different kinds of disabilities. And I think that sometimes can be a struggle to form community over, but it is also not something politicians can afford to ignore either, because it's all of their constituents, not just a group that they might like to, push off to the side and not hear from. It's elderly people too, right? And it's people who need,
Mhm.
some sort of different kinds of aids. So I think always reaching out and saying, "Hey, I'm one of your constituents, and this really matters to me, and you need to do this," is a good thing to do for any of us. So, I mean, it doesn't mean they'll always listen, but it is their job to hear you. And
Mhm.
it's we elect them. I say this all the time too. They don't have power without the people casting the ballot. So, remember what you like and what you don't like when it comes into going to the polling place on election day.
That's really great advice. And I wanted to come back to something you talked about earlier. So, a really great way, it is great to reach out to these people and, give them a human connection. Like, hey, I'm a real voter. I want to vote for you, but I need to make sure you're going to uphold your end of the deal and respect my rights. But you also talked about people that, are multiply marginalized and, maybe are low income and don't have the opportunity to have time to get on the phone and argue with legislators. So, what do you think this is something that people with more power really need to take responsibility for? Or is there ways that we can help people with maybe less opportunities be able to do that as well?
I think one of the things that we can demand, and recognizing people who have the ability and the time and the bandwidth to make those calls, one of the things that we should demand is that these people that we are calling go into these communities that they don't hear from as often, and to figure out themselves why they're not hearing from these communities. Because I do think we should all be very careful, and I think about this a lot as a white person, is I don't want to be speaking for anyone. People can speak for themselves. There are really no voiceless people, right? There's just people who haven't gotten a mic,
Absolutely.
and I feel that way as a disabled person too. Like I don't want a person who hasn't experienced disability pretending to understand what our lived experience is like. I want them to say
Absolutely.
to Yeah, like we want them to say to their officials, like, hey, you should talk to so and so because they actually go through this. And so I think that that is something that we can do is if we notice that, our elected officials are not really present in a lot of these communities, and if they're not really hearing from their constituents, we can make those demands of them and say, hey, you need to be holding town halls here. You need to be knocking on doors and finding ways to reach out to the people in these communities and see what they're telling you they need. Because a lot of the time people, like I said, they don't know where to go, they don't know who to call, and that's true for disability resources as it's true for candidates too, right? So, and and in defense of the candidates, people don't always know where to reach out to unless someone reminds them too, right? Like, hey, you're forgetting
Yeah.
about this community, or you should go hear from the folks in this neighborhood because they've had a lot of issues with this and they'd really like someone to talk to about it. And that's something I try to do when I call, especially like city council members and stuff like that too. When we
Mhm.
talk about like accessibility just on a very local level, I was complaining the other week that I couldn't use my sidewalks in my wheelchair because they need to be repaved. Like it's easier to go over the
Mhm.
grass. And I was just thinking like, okay, well, my neighbors are also having this issue because I have more, there are more people in wheelchairs in the neighborhood than just me. So, like, what can we do to, work together? And recognizing that sometimes my voice is going to resonate more with people who are accustomed to talking to white people, right? Like, which is not fair, but I should use that, right? I should say, like, hey, you really
Mhm.
need to come hear from all of us because it's not just me, my neighbors too, right? So I think it's important that we remember that.
I think that's very important, especially as, like you said, it never goes well when we have non-disabled allies leading discussions about disability, because no matter how much you learn, no matter how much you try, there's always going to be a disconnect between you and the people that are actually living this firsthand. And so I'm always hesitant whenever I hear someone say, "Oh, I'm a great ally." It's like, who has told you that?
Right.
Where did you get this information, and why? So and I agree. There
I
is
like
a lot
that.
of the 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 process of having privilege is it's a very fine line, because yes, use it, but pass it on. Give
Hmm.
this platform to people that would not have it otherwise. And that's something I think is with disability is very okay. In my experience, I have been sort of I feel like a lot of my opportunities, a lot of maybe even this job, I have unfairly. I feel like there are so many other people that should be doing this, that should be having conversations with people like you, and that should be, going to college, that aren't or were passed over for the scholarships or the opportunities that I've been given because they weren't white, or they were spoken a different way. Maybe they used AAC, or maybe they
Hmm.
were more, something was different about them that made them less marketable. And I think this is why it's something that keeps me up at night a little bit, because I wonder how many people, I do my best in my broadcasts to actually reflect the disability community and the people that are actually experiencing these issues. And that's why I decided to do one on police brutality, because this is something that disability community isn't often brought in on, even though we're a part of it as well. And people in the state may not know that they're a part of it. But again, I feel like there's someone that could be doing this better than I could, and I want to connect with those people and make sure that this is a group effort, because I don't represent the true majority of the disability community in Alabama, and I think that's a great thing to bring up as well.
I think it's always worth remembering too that there are so many ways to do this work, right? That and like you said, a lot of the time it is the fine line between like knowing what your privilege is and passing the mic, but and being able to use that privilege in important ways and then recognizing when you need to use it. And then also always being okay with the fact that someone may tell you like you could have done better using your privilege in this situation and not taking that deeply personally, but being like, yeah, I could have. Thank you for telling me. Right. Like now I know and I won't do that again. Um, and I think that's hard as a human being, I think, for people too, right? Like nobody wants to be doing this wrong. Nobody wants to harm anyone. And I think sometimes our first reaction can be to be defensive. But I know I've done a lot of learning in a lot of different spaces and been called out and called in and learned from those experiences. And I think that as long as we recognize that my favorite community agreement is none of us knows everything, but together we know a lot. And I feel like that's very true for disability advocacy too, is that I need to remember always when my place is not to speak for a certain kind of experience, right? Like I can only speak to mine and then remind folks to listen to these other groups and these other individuals about what their experiences are like, and can use our collective privilege to signal boost their experiences, but not to ever say, well, my friend is so and so and I know what they go through, because of course we don't, right? It's like you were talking about allyship, that to me, truly good allies don't need to say I'm a good ally, right? Like you never need to say it out loud. You just either, would be and people would know and that would be enough for you, or it's not, right? So I think it's important that we're always like approaching advocacy with humility too, that there's always more we can learn and there are always things that we could have done better, but we will do them better because that's the goal, right? Like that's the obligation. So but it is hard. And the self reflection is good, I will say too. Like I think it can be exhausting, but the day you don't, like the day you don't reflect on, was I the right person to do this? Should I have been, that's the day I think that it's easy to become too arrogant. So it's important to do
Mm-hmm.
that.
So, one thing I wanted to bring up when we're talking about this sort of representation issue is what would you say to someone who feels like they don't belong in existing disability spaces that have been created in the state or just in the region, in the country? What would you say to someone who feels like I'm too different, I'm too controversial, my opinions aren't going to be given a platform?
It's a hard one because I think, and the thing I see the most in disability advocacy nationwide, not just Alabama specific, is we are starting as advocates to become more aware of the impact of mental health on this work and the ways in which people have different kinds of intellectual and cognitive and developmental disabilities, but I do not see people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities represented well in disability advocacy at all. And that's like I said, that's nationwide. That's not just in Alabama. Certainly not in government or in disability services, and also in disability advocacy. And that's something that I find very unfortunate, but very true. And so I wouldn't blame someone for saying, I don't see myself in this space. Like, who am I supposed to talk to? How am I going to find community here? And I think one of the unfortunate answers to that is to you have a couple of different options. I think you can carve your own space or you can carve your way into those spaces. And neither I think are emotionally simple and they are both unfair, right? Like you shouldn't have to do either of those things. Um, but I do think that over time, looking in the right places will find you the right communities that are extremely accepting of lots of different viewpoints and the recognition always that this this community is so diverse because it just is, right? Because anyone can experience a disability. It's just, and there are going to be disagreements and arguments about the way we should do things, and those are not inherently bad. But I think the inclusivity aspect of it, I think, is the hardest barrier I've seen people face. And this is true for people who are non-white especially as well. So like different types of intellectual and developmental disabilities who are Black or brown or indigenous, I think struggle even more to find organizations and communities of people that understand the issues that they've experienced specifically related to their identity. A lot of leadership around the country is white, and a lot of leadership around the country are wheelchair users. And that does
Right.
not speak to the experience of everyone, right? Like that doesn't speak to the experience of a lot of us, and are very generally, I think I'm seeing progress on the LGBTQ plus front as well too. Not as much as
Mhm.
I'd like, but progress in the sense that people are recognizing, especially with more anti-trans legislation that's come up. I'm seeing people recognize a little bit more the intersection of health and healthcare and disability and like queer identity in different ways, but not seeing enough of it. So I think that my answer too is that we have to, those of us who have the ability to, have to do a better job of not making people have to ask themselves those questions, right? Like, I don't really see myself here. Who do I talk to? Is a question that no one with a disability should have to ask themselves. And our job is to fix that if we are in those spaces. That it's not their job to fix it. It is our job. Like what do we need to do better to make sure that you don't feel that way when you walk in the door or the Zoom room or whatever, right? So yeah.
I think that's really important. And you're absolutely right that the people that are already in these spaces, it's kind of our job to open the door, say, hey, you know, we're doing, come in, we want to hear your
Mm-hmm.
perspective as well. And I think that what you brought up about the anti-trans bills and things that have been passing lately is really important. I'd like to talk about the Magic City Acceptance Academy a little bit on here at some point, because I know some of the people there, some of the administrators even, and it's like we have so many people with disabilities here. It's such a thing, and there's so much intersection that kind of gets forgotten, and I think nobody, especially not people in legislation, really want to talk about. So it's important to, I think, have a broader view of what disability is when you're creating these spaces. Because it's not just for someone that looks like you, it's not just for someone with your same abilities. And I definitely
Hmm.
think that there's an overrepresentation of wheelchair users. And anytime there's a
Hmm.
show, it's someone with a wheelchair. So anytime
Hmm.
there's like media representation. So,
Yeah.
and as wheelchair users, I think, we have to, like, I'm a wheelchair user, and I think about that sometimes. I'm like, I feel like I'm the stereotypical kind of situation here. So,
I feel like that too. So, but
yeah.
it's good that we recognize it. I mean, like, okay, enough of me. Like, we don't need any more pictures of me in a wheelchair. Like, yeah, cool. But like, what else? How else can we represent people? Because it's just, and a lot of the time, disability is unseen, right? Like, and we need to
Mhm.
acknowledge that too. So,
Right. I know there's really a huge dearth of people, like especially like autistic people in like leadership positions
mhm.
around the state and in spaces like this. And that's something that it's going to be reflected in policy. You can't have people that don't understand another person's life making policy that concerns them. It's like that.
Right.
What is it? Nothing about us without us. And I think we need a broader
Yeah,
definition of us.
I have a friend, the incredible Karen Korb, who used to work for Lakeshore Foundation here in the area and moved during the pandemic. But she taught me nothing without us, and I just to say that and say it bare like that, and I really like that because I think that nothing about us without us is very valid. It's just that we are everywhere, right? Like of all
Mhm.
different kinds of like disabilities, and that like absolutely nothing should be done without us, even if it doesn't, even if an able-bodied person does not think it relates to disability, right? Like, which is sort of what you're talking about too, like with school and with all of these various like like the Magic City Acceptance Center you mentioned too. Like it is all of all policy is going to affect disabled people, like all of it. So
Mhm.
like how do we make sure that the people making the policy have disabilities themselves and can speak to those experiences is really important.
Right. So I'm so excited to see the work y'all are going to do with Adap and just anything. Is there anything, before we go, is there anything going on that you think people should attend? Any town halls, any events where people can get more information about their rights and maybe even how they can make whatever organizations they're already a part of more accessible to increase voting? So is there anything you recommend?
Yeah, there's a couple different things. I was going to say, I certainly, we always have materials that we're trying to share about the upcoming election and deadlines. You can go on our website and look for a lot of that stuff. There's also a voting guide on our website now on how to get a voter ID, how to vote absentee, also how to restore your voting rights if they've ever been taken away for any reason. We also have resources on who can vote and how, and I should mention too that if you or somebody you know is under a guardianship, it doesn't inherently mean they can't vote. So we have some information on that. It can mean that, but it doesn't always mean that. And there's often an assumption that someone with a disability can't vote because they're not, quote, mentally competent. But
Mhm.
that's a legal term that can only be used by a judge. Only a judge can declare someone mentally incompetent. So I think that, and there are resources on that on our website as well. I will also be doing early next month before the absentee ballot deadline and before the May 24th primaries. I'm going to be doing a voting training on Facebook Live for some of this stuff too. So if people are confused about how to apply for an absentee ballot, if people kind of don't know what to do if their polling place isn't accessible, we have some answers for that too. And then I will also always ask people on our website, we have a survey link under our voting section to if you are feeling like this is an important issue for you, once you cast your ballot, take our survey on what your experience was like. It is really helpful for us because one of the things we talk about a lot is we can't be at every polling location. Like, and my voting rights fellow and I are doing poll monitoring this year in Mobile County to determine accessibility, but we can't be everywhere, right? There are so many polling locations. So we rely a lot on the public to be able to say, hey, I went here and I couldn't easily open the door, or there was no ramp, or no one would help me with my ballot, or no one would read my ballot to me. And we won't know that unless you tell us. So it's useful for us to have that input from the public. And all of this stuff will go up on our social media and stuff too. So if you're interested, you can follow ADAP on social media, and all of our events and calendar stuff will be posted there too. And hopefully soon to be TikTok. We'll see.
Well, that's exciting. That's a great platform for engaging younger audiences. I think that'll be super helpful. I'll definitely check out those resources for myself because honestly, I think a lot of people, we forget about voting. It's like, oh no, election's coming up.
Oh yeah,
So
that again. Yeah.
yeah.
It's easy to get over. It's easy to get overwhelmed, and I get why a lot of folks only vote in presidential elections because there's so much media around them that you can't forget. Whereas, like I'm always saying, local ultimately impacts our lives more, but gets a lot less press. So I mean,
Right.
it's good to have the reminder. So we will remind you if you like our page.
Absolutely. So I encourage everyone to go and like that page because this is really important when it comes to disability rights issues. Like the state level is so you're absolutely right that that's going to affect us more than the the federal. That's the word I was looking for. So I think usually Alex will go and post the links at the end. So anyone, if you're interested in following ADAP and getting a part of their social media, all the links they have, definitely look in the chat here. And I wanted to say hey to Sarah Williams. Thank you for watching our broadcast. We love you. We love all of our anchors at Alabama Care. So thank you so much for being on here, Nikki. It's so nice to meet you. I would any way that Alabama Care or me can help ADAP and to help people vote more and have better access to our government would be absolutely amazing. So keep us in touch.
Well, thank you, McCartney. Yeah, I'll definitely be pestering you now that you said that. You're going to regret it, but no, it
Absolutely
was
not.
really it was lovely to be here today, and it was really great to meet you. This was a really wonderful experience. So thank you.
Thank you too.
Thanks for saying bye to folks.
Oh, well, bye everyone. I hope you enjoyed and sorry if you're stressed, but remember voting will help. You can feel better. Just get out there and
You
let us know if
will at
anything
least
goes wrong.
you'll feel better for a minute, which is something.
Any solace.
Yes, exactly. Welcome to 2022. But thanks again.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye, y'all. Thanks for having me.